I woke up to the sound of the coffee machine brewing. The rich aroma filled the house, just like it had every morning for years. But something was different now. I wasn't the one she was making it for. Lenora used to wake up and prepare 2 cups, one for herself, one for me. It was our little routine. Even on rushed mornings, even when we were running late, she'd always make sure I had mine. But lately, there was only 1 cup on the counter. Hers. I stood in the doorway, watching as she scrolled through her phone, completely unaware of my presence. Or maybe she was aware and just didn't care. "Morning," I said, forcing my voice to sound light. She barely glanced up. Morning. Flat. Lifeless. No warmth, no interest, no anything. I watched her take a slow sip, her gaze fixed on the screen. It was like I wasn't even there. For weeks, I had been trying to pretend this was normal, that maybe she was just tired or preoccupied. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else. Something I wasn't ready to face. A marriage doesn't fall apart overnight. It happens in moments. In the way she no longer laughed at my jokes. In how she pulled away when I reached for her hand. In how her phone was always face down, and her notifications were silenced. And in the way she made a single cup of coffee. I swallowed the lump in my throat and walked past her, heading to the fridge as if everything was fine. As if my wife wasn't treating me like a stranger in my own home. But inside, something inside me was shifting. I just didn't know it yet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my untouched coffee. Lenora was still there, but in every way that mattered, she was already gone. She sat across from me, her phone held at just the right angle so I couldn't see the screen. Her expression was blank, but her fingers moved quickly, typing someone. I used to know what made her smile. I used to be the person she couldn't wait to talk to. Now, I wasn't even worth a glance. The sound of her nails tapping against the screen filled the room, louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the clock ticking on the wall. It was a sound I had come to despise. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was bitter. "Do you have any plans today?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She barely reacted. "Busy." That was all she said. One word. No explanation. No follow-up. Just busy. And that was when I felt it, the quiet shift from sadness to something colder. I had spent weeks walking on eggshells, giving her space, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, if I was patient enough, things would go back to the way they used to be. But that morning, something in me finally snapped. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what was happening. It was the way she never picked up her phone around me, how she'd turn away whenever she received a text, the way she locked the screen like it was second nature, how she suddenly had late meetings and girls' nights that she never had before, the way she avoided eye contact when I asked her anything about where she'd been. Most of all, it was the way she had stopped caring. I used to think if someone was cheating, they'd try to cover their tracks better, that they'd at least make an effort to keep up the illusion. But Lenora had simply stopped pretending. It was like she had already made her choice. She was just waiting for me to figure it out. And I had. I watched her from across the table, waiting, hoping for her to lift her head, to meet my eyes, to notice the way my entire world was cracking. But she didn't. She just kept typing. I set my mug down carefully, my fingers tightening around the handle before I let go. My pulse was steady, my breathing even, but something inside me was shifting. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just done. "Lenora," I said, my voice quiet but firm. She paused for a fraction of a second before looking up. Her eyes met mine, but there was no warmth, no curiosity, no sign that she cared about what I was about to say. Just mild irritation, as if I was interrupting something more important. What? That was it. No concern. No hesitation. Just a sharp, impatient demand. And that was when I knew. It wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just a rough patch or stress or a phase she was going through. This was something else, something final. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I studied her face, memorizing every detail. The slight furrow in her brow, the way her lips pressed together just a little too tightly. The way she held her phone, ready to go right back to her conversation the second I stopped talking. I had loved this woman. I had built a life with her. But in that moment, I realized I was the only one still holding on. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Never mind," I said. My voice was calm. Too calm. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. It scraped against the floor, the sound echoing through the room. I saw her tense, just slightly, but she didn't say anything. She just watched me with that same distant expression, waiting to see if I was going to make a scene. But I wasn't. I had already made my decision. I was done waiting for an explanation that would never come. I was done pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me. I turned away, walking toward the bedroom, my mind already racing with what I needed to do next. And for the first time in weeks, Lenora actually looked up. "Where are you going?" she asked. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. To pack. I walked into the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the bed we had shared for years. It looked untouched, perfectly made, too perfect, like a hotel bed. Lenora hadn't slept next to me in weeks, and I had stopped asking why. I already knew the answer. I just didn't want to say it out loud. I ran a hand down my face, exhaling slowly. My body felt heavy, like I had been carrying something for too long and my arms were finally giving out. I was exhausted. Not in the way that sleep could fix, but the kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones. The kind that comes from fighting for something you know is already lost. I crossed the room and pulled out a suitcase, the same one we had used on vacations together. We had taken trips to the coast, to the mountains, to places that felt like escapes from reality. Back then, I had thought we were happy. I had thought we were building something permanent. But looking at it now, I realized how temporary everything had been. The zipper made a harsh sound as I dragged it open. I stared at the empty space inside. It felt like a metaphor. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay here. I reached for the closet, pulling out clothes at random. Jeans, shirts, a couple of jackets. I wasn't thinking about what I needed, just that I had to keep moving. If I stopped, if I let myself sit with the reality of what was happening, I might break. And I couldn't afford to break. Not yet. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel her standing there, watching me. "What are you doing?" Her voice was careful, almost cautious, like she was testing the waters. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I folded a sweater, smoothing out the fabric before placing it in the suitcase. "You don't get to act surprised, Lenora." My voice came out even, but inside, my chest felt tight, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. I heard her shift, but she didn't move closer. "I don't know what you mean." A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Of course, she was going to play dumb. She always did. "You haven't spoken to me in weeks," I said, turning to face her. "Not really. Not in any way that matters. You've been avoiding me, treating me like I don't exist. Like I'm some inconvenience you have to put up with." I gestured toward the suitcase. "So I'm making it easier for you. I'm leaving." Her expression barely changed, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Not sadness. Not regret. Just calculation. "Where will you go?" The fact that she even had to ask told me everything. She wasn't worried about me. She was just trying to figure out what this meant for her. I shrugged. "I'll figure it out." For the first time in weeks, she actually looked at me, really looked at me. Her gaze lingered, like she was seeing me for the first time in a long time. But I wasn't the same person I had been before. I wasn't the man who kept waiting for scraps of affection, who kept making excuses for her coldness. That man was gone. "You're overreacting," she said, folding her arms. I let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the suitcase. "No, Lenora. I'm finally reacting." She didn't reply. Instead, she just stood there, watching as I packed. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't do anything. And that told me more than words ever could. I zipped up the suitcase and grabbed my keys from the nightstand. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. I zipped up the suitcase, but I didn't move right away. I just stood there, gripping the handle, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight but everything it represented. The years I had spent building this life. The memories that used to bring me comfort. The love I had poured into a marriage that now felt like a dried-up well. All of it was packed up in this single, ordinary suitcase. And Lenora? She just stood there, arms crossed, watching me like I was the one being unreasonable. "You're really doing this?" she asked, her tone flat. Not sad. Not angry. Just indifferent. I turned to her, taking in the way she barely even looked at me. She wasn't scared of losing me. That much was obvious. She had already let me go a long time ago. I was just the last one to figure it out. "What else is there to do?" I asked. My voice was calm, steady. I was past the point of yelling, past the point of pleading for answers. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. Some things don't come with explanations. Some people don't give you the decency of honesty. Lenora sighed, rubbing her temples like I was the one giving her a headache. "You're being dramatic, Bennett." A bitter chuckle escaped me before I could stop it. "Dramatic? That's what she thought this was. Weeks of being ignored, of being treated like a ghost in my own home. And now that I had finally had enough, I was the one being unreasonable? It was almost laughable. I lifted my suitcase and walked toward the door. But just as I reached for the handle, she spoke again. Are you going to tell people I'm some kind of villain? I paused, hand tightening around the handle. That question, the way she said it. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She wasn't asking if this was hurting me. She was asking how this was going to look on her. I turned to face her, really looking at her for the first time in what felt like forever. The woman I had married, the woman I had loved so deeply, was barely recognizable now. It wasn't just that she had changed. It was that I had never really known her at all. I don't need to tell anyone anything, Lenora. My voice was quiet but firm. You've done a good enough job showing them yourself. Her expression didn't change. She just exhaled, like this whole conversation was exhausting for her. Like I was exhausting. And in that moment, I realized just how deep her detachment went. She had already moved on. Whether it was with someone else or just within herself, she had let go of this marriage long before I had. I swallowed down the last shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would stop me. That she would ask me to stay. That she would tell me I mattered. But she didn't. She just walked over to the kitchen, picked up her phone, and went back to whatever was more important than me. That was it. That was all the confirmation I needed. I turned the handle and walked out the door, the sound of it clicking shut behind me louder than I expected. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The air outside felt different. Colder. Sharper. Like I had stepped into another world entirely. I stood on the porch for a moment, staring at my car in the driveway. It felt strange, like I was leaving a part of myself behind in that house. But that part of me had already died a long time ago. I took a deep breath and walked toward my car. I threw my suitcase in the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat there. Hands on the wheel. Mind racing. Where do you go when the life you've built crumbles beneath your feet? I had no idea. But for the first time in a long time, I was finally ready to find out. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The house I had lived in for nearly a decade stood behind me, unchanged, silent. It looked like the same home I had walked into every evening after work, the same home where I had once felt safe. But it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. That house was just a shell now, a hollow space filled with old memories and a woman who had stopped seeing me as anything more than an afterthought. I turned the key in the ignition, but I didn't drive off immediately. My heartbeat was steady, but my mind wasn't. It raced, flipping through moments I had ignored, signs I had brushed off. It was only now, sitting here with my entire life packed into a single suitcase, that I could see everything clearly. Lenora had checked out of our marriage long before I had even realized something was wrong. The nights she stayed late at work, the weekends where she suddenly had plans without me, the way she had gradually stopped initiating any kind of affection. It had been so slow, so methodical, that I hadn't even noticed it happening. Like watching the tide pull back from the shore, inch by inch, until one day, the ocean was gone entirely. I let out a slow breath and shifted the car into drive. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. I just knew I couldn't sit there any longer. The streets were quiet as I drove through our neighborhood. It was early, the kind of morning where most people were just beginning their routines, kids getting ready for school, joggers making their way down the sidewalks, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I thought about calling someone, my brother, an old friend, but what would I even say? Hey, I just walked out on my marriage, and I have no idea where I'm going. No, I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Instead, I drove aimlessly, letting the road guide me. The city faded behind me, replaced by open highways and stretches of land that felt endless. I found myself gripping the wheel a little less tightly. My chest felt a little less heavy. Then, almost without thinking, I pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside diner. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, the neon sign flickering slightly, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the air. A place where no one would know me. I sat in the car for a moment, watching people come and go. A trucker walked out carrying a styrofoam cup, nodding at me as he passed. A waitress stood by the entrance, taking a smoke break, her eyes tired but kind. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. Just a moment to breathe. To sit somewhere that wasn't filled with memories of a life that had already ended. I stepped out of the car, stretched my stiff limbs, and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered, the warmth of the place instantly wrapping around me. It was quiet, a few early risers scattered around, an old man reading a newspaper, a couple whispering over pancakes, a lone woman stirring sugar into her coffee. I slid into a booth near the window. A waitress, mid-50s, kind eyes, approached with a notepad. Coffee. I nodded. Yeah, please. She smiled, poured me a cup, and left me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the dark liquid, watching the steam curl into the air. I should have felt broken. I should have felt lost. But instead, I felt something else. Relief. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for something to change. I had finally taken control. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back. I sat in that booth for a long time, hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug, staring out the window as the world moved on without me. The reality of it all was finally setting in. I had left. I had actually walked out of that house, packed a suitcase, and driven off without a plan. And yet, instead of feeling lost, I felt lighter. Like I had just shrugged off a heavy coat I'd been carrying for years without realizing how much it had weighed me down. The waitress came back and topped off my coffee, offering me a warm but knowing smile. Rough morning. I let out a breathy laugh. Something like that. She nodded, not prying, but something in her expression told me she'd seen men like me before, guys who walked into this diner with the same exhausted, lost look in their eyes, sitting in booths with nowhere else to go. She placed a laminated menu in front of me. Well, you look like you could use a meal. First cup of coffee's on the house. Everything else, you're paying for. I smirked. Fair enough. She left me alone again, and I flipped through the menu without really reading it. My mind was still back at that house. I thought about Lenora, about how she had barely reacted when I told her I was leaving. There was no anger, no sadness, just indifference. Maybe that was what hurt the most, not that she had stopped loving me, but that she didn't even care that I was gone. Had she been waiting for this? Had she wanted me to be the one to leave so she wouldn't have to? Maybe this was exactly what she had wanted all along. I closed the menu, my appetite non-existent, and reached for my phone out of habit. The lock screen glowed up at me, no missed calls, no messages. Not from her. Not from anyone. I shouldn't have expected anything. Lenora wasn't the type to chase after someone, and she had made it clear that she had already moved on, even if she hadn't said it out loud. But some stupid, stubborn part of me had still held on to the fantasy that maybe she'd at least ask where I was. That maybe, for a split second, she would wonder if she had pushed too far, if maybe this was the moment she'd realize she had lost something. But there was nothing. And that was my answer. I locked my phone and set it face down on the table. I wasn't going to wait for a message that wasn't coming. The door to the diner chimed, and I looked up just as someone walked in, someone who looked strangely familiar. A woman, about my age, with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun and a leather jacket that looked slightly too big for her frame. She carried a small duffel bag over one shoulder and scanned the diner as if searching for someone. When her gaze landed on me, her lips parted slightly in recognition. It took me a second, but then it hit me. I knew her. Not well, but well enough. Her name was Isla. We had gone to college together, though we had never been particularly close. She had been in a few of my classes, the kind of person I'd exchange casual conversation with before heading our separate ways. I hadn't seen her in years. She hesitated for a moment before approaching my booth. Bennett. I blinked. Isla. A small, surprised laugh escaped her lips. Wow. Small world. I gestured to the empty seat across from me. You want to join me, or just gonna stand there and stare? She smirked and slid into the seat, dropping her duffel bag beside her. I think I just might. What the hell are you doing out here? I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Would you believe me if I said I have no idea? Her expression shifted slightly, something like understanding passing through her eyes. Yeah, she murmured. I think I would. She didn't press for details, and I was grateful for that. Instead, she waved down the waitress and ordered a coffee, then turned back to me with a wry smile. Guess we both ended up in the middle of nowhere at the same time. I studied her for a moment. She looked different from how I remembered, not just older, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Like she, too, had been carrying something heavy. I leaned back in my seat. So, what's your story? She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, exhaling slowly. Probably not that different from yours. I arched a brow. That bad, huh? She let out a quiet chuckle. Something like that. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me, something unexpected. Maybe this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the beginning of something else. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I watched Isla stir sugar into hers, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug in quiet thought. There was something about her presence that felt oddly grounding. Maybe it was because she wasn't pressing for details, wasn't demanding answers. She was just there. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sitting across from someone who looked like they wanted to be somewhere else. She took a sip, then exhaled, shaking her head with a half-smile. I still can't believe I ran into you here. Of all places. I leaned back in the booth, stretching my arms along the back of the seat. Guess fate has a weird sense of humor. Her smirk deepened. Yeah. Or maybe it's just two people with nowhere else to go ending up in the same place. I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. There was a brief pause, not awkward, just loaded. Two people sitting across from each other with too many unsaid things hanging in the air. She finally broke the silence, tilting her head slightly. So, you leaving or running? I let out a slow breath, rubbing my thumb along the rim of my cup. Little of both, I think. She nodded like she understood, because she did. She cheated. The question was blunt, but not cruel. Just matter of fact. And somehow, it didn't sting as much as I thought it would. I hesitated, then shook my head. Honestly, I don't even know. Maybe. Probably. I exhaled sharply. Does it even matter at this point? She studied me for a moment, then shrugged. Maybe not. And somehow, that answer felt right. I had spent so much time obsessing over what Lenora was doing, why she had pulled away, whether there was another man. But sitting here, miles away from that house, from the suffocating silence she had wrapped herself in, I realized it didn't make a difference anymore. The damage was already done. She had stopped seeing me as a person long before I had walked out that door. Whether she was with someone else or not didn't change the fact that I had already lost her. I shook my head, forcing a small chuckle. God, I sound pathetic, don't I? Isla arched a brow. You want the real answer, or the polite one? I huffed out a laugh. Hit me with the real one. She smirked. You sound like someone who just woke up from a coma and realized his life isn't the way he left it. That pulled a laugh from me, an actual, genuine laugh. It was the first one I'd had in weeks. Damn. That bad. She shrugged. You're sitting in a diner at 7 in the morning, looking like you haven't slept in days, nursing a cup of coffee like it's got the answers to life. Yeah, Bennett. It's that bad. I groaned, running a hand down my face. Great. Thanks for the pep talk. She grinned, but then her expression softened slightly. Look, you're not the first guy to get blindsided by someone he trusted. And you won't be the last. She tapped a finger against her mug. But you did the one thing most people don't. I lifted a brow. Oh yeah? And what's that? Her gaze met mine, steady and unwavering. You left. I swallowed, feeling the weight of those words settle into my chest. She was right. I had spent so much time feeling like a fool for not seeing it sooner, for letting it get this far. But at the end of the day, I had walked away. I hadn't stayed in that house, clinging to something that no longer existed. I had chosen myself. And maybe that was the first real step toward whatever came next. I sat back, exhaling slowly. And what about you? I gestured to the duffel bag beside her. What are you running from? She smirked, but there was something guarded in her eyes. Now, that's a story for another cup of coffee. I studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll hold you to that. She lifted her mug in a silent toast. Deal. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about Lenora. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. And for the first time in weeks, I realized I didn't need to go back. The sun had risen higher in the sky by the time Isla and I left the diner. The morning air was crisp, the scent of coffee and bacon still lingering as we stepped outside. I stretched, rolling my shoulders, feeling lighter than I had in weeks, maybe even months. Something had shifted inside me. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. You got a place to go? Isla asked, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag. I let out a breath and glanced toward my car, then shook my head. Not really. But I guess that's part of the adventure now. She grinned. Adventure? Huh? You sound like a man who's finally waking up. I thought about that for a second. Maybe she was right. I had spent so long feeling trapped in my own home, waiting for something to change, waiting for Lenora to give me even the smallest sign that she still cared. But the truth was, I had been waiting for permission to leave a marriage that had ended long before I walked out the door. And now? I didn't need permission for anything. I turned to Isla, a smirk tugging at the corner of my lips. And what about you? You running to somewhere or from something? She exhaled a laugh, looking out at the highway stretching ahead of us. A little of both, I think. There was something in her eyes, something familiar. Like she, too, had been waiting for a reason to stop standing still. I pulled my keys from my pocket and twirled them between my fingers. Well, I was thinking of driving until I find a place that feels right. Could use a co-pilot if you're up for it. Her brows lifted slightly in surprise, but then a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Bennett, are you inviting me on your grand escape? I grinned. Maybe. Unless you've got better plans. She tilted her head, pretending to think about it. Then, with a decisive nod, she slung her bag over her shoulder and walked toward my car. All right, but I picked the music. I laughed, unlocking the doors. Fine, but no country. Deal. We both slid into the car, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel like a man who had just walked away from something. I felt like a man who was finally walking toward something new. As I pulled onto the road, leaving behind the town, the past, and the weight of everything that had held me down, I realized something. I wasn't leaving my life behind. I was finally starting it. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited for what came next.